Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on your time zone. I'm Dania Thafer, the Executive Director at Gulf International Forum. Thank you for joining us for this conversation titled the GCC 41st Summit, Prospects and Challenges for Stalled Crises. As the Gulf Cooperation Council entered into its fifth decade as an institution, the Arab Gulf states embarked on a historic agreement, the Al-Ula Declaration, a declaration of good intent, lifting the air, sea, and blockade off of Qatar after 3.5 years of fervent and impassioned antagonism between Qatar and the blockading states. The tone of the summit was a refreshing one of unity, solidarity, and stability. Of course, this event comes as a welcome and positive step, but the question remains, how effective will it be moving forward? As Winston Churchill famously said, referring to politics, there is no permanent enemy or permanent friend. There are permanent interests. And how has the interest of the GCC states evolved since the onset of the blockade? Can the GCC states move forward while underlying sources of tension remain unresolved? More specifically, can the body function in a similar way as the European Union, where each member has their own independent policies or foreign policies? What role has America's presidential transition played in influencing this agreement? How will the summit impact the ongoing crises and conflicts in the Gulf and across the Middle East? And how will it affect geopolitics? Without further ado, let me introduce our line of speakers today. We have, and I'm going to introduce them in the order of their speaking. We have Dr. Mohammed Alrumaihi. He is a professor at Kuwait University. He served as the editor-in-chief of Awan newspaper, and before that, he was also editor-in-chief of Al-Arabi magazine. Dr. Alrumaihi is the founder and editor-in-chief for daily and monthly publication focused on the Gulf. He is also an advisor on various committees on education, information, culture, and politics for the Kuwaiti government and private institutions across the GCC. He has published more than 25 books. Dr. Kistian Ulrichsen, he's a Baker Institute Fellow for the Middle East, Rice University, and a non-resident senior fellow with us. Previously, he worked as a senior Gulf analyst at the Gulf Center for Strategic Studies and as a co-editor of the Kuwait Program on Development, Governance, and Globalization in the Gulf States at the London School of Economics. He is also he's the author of Qatar and the Gulf Crisis, published by Oxford University Press. Dr. Courtney is an assistant professorial research fellow, at the Middle East Center at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and a senior non-resident fellow with us. She is the author of Rentier Islamism, The Influence of the Muslim Brotherhood in the Gulf, with Oxford University Press. And last but not least, Dr. Abdulla Baabood. He's a visiting professor at Waseda University in Tokyo. Previously, he held a position of the director of the Gulf Studies Center at Qatar University and the director of the Gulf Research Center at the University of Cambridge. Just some housekeeping notes. Each speaker will have 8 minutes, and then we'll proceed to the Q&A discussion. Please feel free to put your questions in the comments section. And then after each speaker had the chance to give their remarks, they will each offer a 2-minute closing remark. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Mohammed Alrumaihi.
I mean, the communication which we have seen today, this morning, from the GCC summit in Al Ula was very good news to me and probably most of the Gulf citizens. It has 120 itemized by local, regional, and sub-regional questions and problems, and it tackles most of what we were worrying about. The symbol is very important as well. When Amir Mohammed bin Salman greeted His Highness Amir Tamim at the steps of the plane, and they hang each other, although it is Corona time. So it was very refreshing. Most of the 120 items of the communique were in general. They refer to the success of the GCC, what was needed to be done after that, and then Iran, Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, and other places which they are of interest of the GCC. I was writing for a long time from the start of this crisis that this crisis is a loss situation for both countries. Of course, it depends on how much the loss of each country is different. The more smaller states, the bigger the loss it will face. So now, unfortunately, it has been left as well to the media, and the media have probably corrupted the atmosphere in general, and it was not been of a help. Here in Kuwait, we had a number of petitions, if you like, written mostly by myself and others, and signed by hundreds of Kuwaitis. We have two petitions saying that we have to look to an outcome of this conflict, because I am a so-called expert in the Gulf, and I know what doesn't mean to the ordinary people. They are family connected. There is social connection. There is a lot to, if you like, to lose in this kind of things. Qatar, of course, started to look around, sometime to the Iranians, sometime to the Turks, and this could, if continue, could hurt the general, if you like, strategic stand of the GCC as a whole. So what's happened that the Kuwaiti have put an effort tremendously to bring both parties together. I have to say that this is the biggest crisis we have seen, but most of the time, which I know, there was some bickering, if you like, between X and Y states in the Gulf, and this is because of the political structure. We are unfortunately still of a tribal outlook in politics, and probably a personal one, and that's what has exaggerated the problem from my point of view. But the good news that this communique, in fact, brings a little bit things which I am very, very optimistic. There will be a general election in Qatar next November. There will be an expo next year in Dubai. Mohammed bin Salman project social and economic project is succeeding. So what we have here is a good success. I think we are one of the region who have been successfully tackling the COVID-19 as well. We have the least number of deaths, and the governments have done a tremendous work together. So if you look to this communique, which is 120 items, it goes into details of a number of things. Hopefully, when the political will be there, I think things will be much, much better. As we know all, any crisis could eventually produce a positive impact, and this is one of them.
Apologies, my microphone was muted. Thank you, Dr. Alrumaihi. And now we'll go ahead and proceed with Dr. Ulrichsen's remarks.
Thank you very much, Dania, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this extremely timely panel. I would start by saying that, to me at least, it was no coincidence that a crisis that began with the arrival of the Trump administration in early 2017 is seemingly coming to an end, or at least to an agreement, now that that administration is about to leave office in 2 weeks' time. I find it hard to imagine that a crisis of this sort could have taken place under another US administration. I think a lot of it had its roots in what Dr. Alrumaihi commented about the personalization of politics and the assumption, or at least the feeling, in early 2017 among officials in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi and perhaps elsewhere, that the Trump administration or the Trump White House was potentially open to action that would have been unlikely in quote-unquote normal times, but that wouldn't really have any pushback if it was taken during the Trump administration. And I think the fact that the blockade happened 2 weeks after Trump's first overseas visit to Riyadh in May 2017, and that Trump himself then referred back in his initial comments and support for the blockade to conversations he had had in Riyadh, kind of illustrated that. I think the miscalculation that was made was the assumption that if the White House and that President Trump and his circle switched sides, the rest of the US government would follow suit. And of course, what we saw in 2017 with the Secretaries of State and Defense and the US military authorities as well, making it very clear that the US is not picking winners in this debate. It has interests and partnerships on all sides. And in a sense, from September 2017 onwards, when the Emir of Kuwait, Sheikh Sabah Al-Ahmed, went to the White House and stood out with President Trump and sort of called for Gulf unity once again, over the past 3 years and 4 months, there has been a sort of holding pattern where you would have periods of attempts to try and resolve the issue. And of course, now with the impending departure from office, it has been resolved. And I think the fact that the GCC summit was pushed back from its normal positioning in December to January the 5th, on the one hand, did give more time to try and reach negotiations to reach a deal, but it also was a sort of way of splitting the difference, I think, from a Saudi point of view, of giving the outgoing Trump administration, and particularly Jared Kushner, another win on his Middle East policy, even though it's a solution of a dispute that should never have started. So you give the administration sort of what they want initially, but you also give the incoming Biden administration something to work with as well. So I think having the summit so close to the inauguration was a way for the Saudis to signal to the Biden administration that this is one less regional file that you'll have to deal with when you take office. It was, I think, an attempt as well by the Saudis to portray Mohammed bin Salman as a sort of a statesman. We saw how Mohammed bin Salman was the figure who was front and center of the summit. We saw how he was the one who greeted the Emir of Qatar at the aeroplane, how he was the one who embraced Sheikh Tamim And I think it was very much about sending a message as well to the incoming Biden team that Mohammed bin Salman is a statesman. He has learned the lessons of the last 4 years. He too is ready to move on. And I think that message will be crucial if US-Saudi relations, and especially the relations that Mohammed bin Salman will have with an incoming Democrat administration, are to succeed. And of course, the events overnight in Georgia, which make it likely that the Democrats may have control of the Senate as well, arguably make it all the more important from the Saudi point of view that they can at least try to begin to repair the political relationship they had or they have with the US, especially now with Democrats potentially having all three sort of House, Senate, and the White House. So I think Mohammed bin Salman's presence, kind of leadership of the summit was very important in that respect. Also because it's quite likely, although we have no idea until it happens, that at some point over the next 4 years, Mohammed bin Salman may well become king. And so he may well have to become king at a time when Joe Biden and the Democrats are in charge in the White House and in Congress. And so as a way of showing that there have been mistakes over the last 4 years, we can move on. That may not be enough to try to undo all the damage, such as the fallout from the murder of Jamal Khashoggi in 2018, but that, together with potentially other issues such as resolving or at least finding a way of withdrawing Saudi forces from Yemen, perhaps also freeing the female detainees in Saudi prison, those are steps, I think, that have been accelerated by the fact that the Biden administration is coming into office in a couple of weeks' time. And arguably, this crisis began with an eye on Washington in 2016, 2017, and it's ending with an eye on Washington in 2021 as well. Now, whether or not that will be enough to paper over all the differences, the ways that this crisis impacted upon individuals and communities in the Gulf, the ways that people were split from extended families and had to endure campaigns on media and social media is another issue. I think those legacies will take longer. And I also, I think going forward, the GCC will have to ensure, or at least have to try to ensure, that their own mechanisms, their own dispute settlement mechanism is the one used in any future disputes to ensure that you don't have power plays taking place outside the confines of the GCC, as happened in 2017. That keeping it within the GCC mechanism, I think, within that framework will be an important confidence-boosting measure if all parties are to learn to live with each other once more. And so I have some hope that at least the political aspect of this crisis is now easing, but I think the social legacies will take longer, and the institutional legacy, the fact that the GCC is now at least led by a Secretary General from Kuwait rather than from one of the blockading states, as was the case until February 2020, I think that also offers a chance for a new beginning at least. And whether the GCC can adapt and to sort of learn from the past 4 years, and whether it's given the space from the member states to do so, I think that will be an important thing to follow going forward as well. So with that, I'll pass back to Dania and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Kistian. I just want to make a point to the audience. Please post your questions early on in the comment section so we can go ahead and pose them to the panel. Now we'll proceed to Dr. Courtney Freer.
Thanks so much for having me. I should start by saying that this is certainly an encouraging development and one that hopefully will lead to a more productive and cooperative Gulf moving forward. And as such, is a development that is certainly welcomed by the EU and the West more broadly. And I've been asked to talk primarily about kind of the EU and I guess more broadly the Western reaction to and pressure that led to kind of the GCC summit that we saw yesterday. So I think that after the 13 demands were revealed by the blockading states back in the summer of 2017, few of us would have thought that a resolution of this nature could have been reached, especially one that seems so broad-based and also took place largely in private. This rift, unlike others that have taken place among the GCC states, was of course extremely public, which I think will make a full resolution and restoration of trust, as Kistian mentioned, a long process. But this is certainly an important beginning and one that is viewed favorably by the EU, by the rest of kind of Western states that I'm going to be focusing a bit on. That said, there are still very real concerns in Europe and in the West more broadly about bilateral relationships, particularly when it comes to Saudi Arabia, that have to do with the country's domestic human rights record rather than with the blockade itself. In fact, it is arguably the election of a Biden administration that is likelier to hold Saudi Arabia accountable for its human rights abuses, which led to this rapprochement. Of course, Biden has been outspoken about isolating Saudi Arabia due to its human rights record at home, particularly after the killing of Jamal Khashoggi in 2018. Beyond that, US Congress has in the past tried to stop arms trade to Saudi Arabia for weaponry to be used in Yemen, as did the European Parliament. The German government and, of course, the UK court ruling also have deemed as unlawful the sale of arms to Saudi Arabia, largely, again, over concerns about the campaign in Yemen. Further ahead of last November's G20 virtual summit hosted by Riyadh, 45 members of US Congress wrote a letter to the Trump administration asking basically that they boycott the G20 unless Saudi authorities addressed human rights concerns, specifically those related to the war in Yemen, the imprisonment of political activists, and the lack of accountability for the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. That letter, interestingly, followed the submission of a resolution by 65 members of the European Parliament calling on the EU to downgrade its attendance to the summit by withdrawing the participation of European Commission President and European Council President, again, due to concerns about human rights. Notably, these boycotts didn't happen, but I think the fact that there was legislative support, at least to a limited extent, for these types of boycotts demonstrates the difficulties in this relationship. Furthermore, the mayors of London, Los Angeles, New York, and Paris also chose to boycott the U20 Urban Summit in advance of the G20 over similar concerns. So there are very real anxieties about shaping relations with Saudi Arabia beyond the blockade of Qatar, which Western states, I think, largely viewed as unnecessary foreign policy adventurism, which did isolate important Western allies from one another and made multilateral action much more difficult, particularly at the time when there has been concern about the role of Iran in the Gulf. And there were also moves towards an EU GCC free trade agreement. So there were multilateral actions that were stopped largely due to the start of this rift. And the sentencing at the end of last month to 5 years in prison on terrorism charges of Lujaina Abdulla, who's a Saudi women's rights activist who advocated for women's right to drive, again, I think highlighted the extent to which Western pressure or the threat of it does not really seem to have an effect on domestic political moves in Saudi Arabia, at least not yet. This could be changing. Arguably, Western pressure did have some effect on this rapprochement that we've seen in the GCC crisis. And so we could see changes at home in Saudi Arabia as well, as Kistian kind of alluded to. The issue of political prisoners linked to the GCC crisis will also likely arise. Internationally known Muslim scholar Salman al-Oda, along with other prominent clerics, was imprisoned on charges of terrorism and conspiracy against the state in Saudi Arabia in 2017, a few hours after tweeting that he had hoped for reconciliation between Qatar and Saudi Arabia. And since that time, he has been accused of having links with the Qatari ruling family. So the blockade did lead to kind of difficulties in terms of domestic freedom of expression. Legislation in the UAE also criminalized shows of sympathy for Qatar shortly after the blockade was put in place. So the blockade did lead to, as I mentioned, restrictions on freedom of expression, something which is troubling to Western allied states and which showed, I think, how the blockade could be used to exercise more control over local populations. I think it's also worth noting that the restoration of diplomatic relations, though certainly important, does not necessarily imply deep friendship or alliance. It's really a baseline for further confidence-building measures, which hopefully we'll see in the coming months. Again, as Kistian mentioned, it will take quite a long time for these countries, I think, to trust each other again. And I think it's also incorrect to view the Gulf as one bloc just because the blockade has ended. And I think this often comes up in the West, particularly I think we've seen this in discussions in the EU, that the Gulf is seen as having, quite a similar group of countries. These countries that are oil rich are largely politically stable, and so are seen to have kind of similar concerns. And I think in a sense, the blockade has had a positive effect in that it has forced us to see these states as individuals rather than as part of one bloc, which is necessarily united and necessarily has kind of the same interests. Indeed, since the start of the blockade, we've seen increasingly independent foreign policies by these individual states, particularly with Saudi Arabia, and I guess to a larger extent, arguably, by the UAE, which has taken kind of opposite stances of Qatar, largely opposing political Islam or groups and individuals associated with it in places like Libya and Sudan, in the Horn of Africa, effectively exporting ideological dimensions of the rift outward in a way that cannot as easily be reversed as can the physical blockade. We've also seen very different stances when it comes to normalization with Israel. Again, the blockading states were not even unified with this. We've had only Bahrain and the UAE thus far normalized relations with Israel, and no further announcements on that moving forward. And so there are very fundamental differences among the GCC states in terms of the place of political Islam in society in the Middle East more broadly, as well as the place of Israel in the Middle East. So I think it's likely that we may see relationships between Western and GCC states as bilateral, at least for the immediate future. There's also a lot of question marks about how intact the GCC is. Of course, rumors emerged because only 2 out of 6 of the heads of states attended the GCC summit. There's also, I think it is concerning that such an action managed to be taken without the conflict resolution mechanism within the GCC becoming involved really in stopping the blockade earlier on. Of course, Kuwaiti mediation started basically from the start of the blockade, but it remains to be seen how united or how functional the GCC is. So can an EU-GCC free trade agreement, for instance, be even talked about at this point? At what point can it be spoken about and become a realistic possibility? More broadly, there's also a desire, of course, among the EU states and the Biden administration to revive the JCPOA in some form. A unified GCC, I would argue, is easier to include in potential negotiations with Iran, although notably the Obama administration failed to include the regional bloc in the run-up to the JCPOA, having dealt exclusively with Oman. Right now, it seems that Kuwait, Qatar, and Oman would be kind of the most willing to be involved in any kind of reformulation of the JCPOA, and so are seen as potentially being able to drag along kind of more hesitant states that are more hesitant to become involved in any discussions about a reformulation of the JCPOA. So I think this is something that the EU will be pushing for moving forward, and I think that the Yemen war, potential end to the Yemen war, now that the UAE has withdrawn its military support and now that a Biden administration could end American involvement, this could also potentially help push forward some more, at least willingness to discuss reformulation of the JCPOA. In terms of global energy markets, which of course are of a concern to the West, to the EU, to everyone, Saudi Arabia, I think, surprised a lot of us yesterday with large unilateral output cuts for February and March. The market, of course, remains fragile, and I think the Saudis demonstrated their hope and intention to avoid another oil price war like the one that occurred last year with Russia. And I think this is something that's appreciated kind of worldwide, that Saudi Arabia was able to take this step and to put forth a more multilateral energy policy, which would certainly, I think, be a welcome development and is definitely a positive step. And just to conclude, I think moving forward, we can expect more Western support for confidence-building measures among the GCC states. In terms of building bilateral ties, I think there will be efforts to do this, but there are still major concerns, particularly when it comes to human rights issues related to many of the Gulf states, not just Saudi Arabia. And so I think in the next few weeks, we'll see kind of how things develop in terms of the GCC becoming more of a unified bloc, and in terms of how the EU and the rest of the West chooses to engage with this bloc. Thank you.
Thank you, Courtney. Let's move to Dr. Abdulla Baabood. I think there's something with the video. Dr. Baabood, are you there? Your microphone is muted.
Yes, I'm there, but I can't see my picture, but that's okay. I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the kind invitation to participate with this distinguished panel, and very much enjoyed the input from all my colleagues who have spoken before me. I think they have covered the issue very well. If I may have to add something, is to say that, look, the crisis was abrupt. It was totally unnecessary, and it could have been mitigated. It could have been resolved earlier through negotiations and dialogue. Unfortunately, this did not happen. And it also, like it started, it also ended abruptly. No one really expected this, although there were signs that the crisis was going to be resolved, or there was some negotiation taking place. And until the last moment, no one knew if the Emir of Qatar was going to attend the summit, and it was kind of a last-minute attempt by Kuwait that has been doing great job in the background, trying to reconcile the differences of all the parties involved. And of course, one does not exclude the efforts of the United States in this regard, and Oman also been helping in the background to see if they can help the Kuwaiti initiative, etc. So I also echo my colleagues of what they have said, that this is a great moment. It's great to have all the GCC back and working together, and to see that these countries are working towards the same goals, which is economic development, prosperity, security, and of course more cooperation and integration. Now, what led to the crisis, to the ending of the crisis? Obviously, it has been mentioned by some of the colleagues. There are, of course, global changes that were taking place with the Biden administration, and the change in the leadership in the United States, and maybe a change of policy that will follow. But also there were regional implications as well. And so that was on one side. The other side, obviously, the crisis have gone for very long, and no benefit has occurred to anybody. In fact, it's been costly to all the countries involved. All parties that were involved in the crisis had to suffer from this. Even countries that were not involved suffered as well because of the crisis. So basically, there was no tangible benefit at all. If anything, there was cost to everybody. And given what is going on now in terms of the pandemic and the human cost of the coronavirus, as well as the health and implications and economic implications, most of the economies of the Gulf states are suffering. This is more so because of also the low oil prices and the oil price war that happened some time ago, and also because of the low demand globally for oil. And as you know, the Gulf states are in the main oil and hydrocarbon exporting countries. And obviously their economies have been badly affected. Also their investments abroad have been affected, because the economies and investments are kind of linked together in the global economy, and their sovereign wealth funds have been facing some financial challenges. And of course, the crisis in the region, whether it is in Yemen, whether it is the Gulf crisis itself, whether it's support for different groups in different countries, and they're competing and rivaling against each other, has costed them a fortune. So I think, at the end, it seems that there seems to be now some kind of a recognition that this has been a very costly and a very costly conflict that has no benefit to anybody, and it needed to be to stop. Obviously, also, some of my colleagues mentioned the fact that the forthcoming American administration might actually start the GCPOA and a negotiation for the GCPOA. So you need a unified GCC stand. Now, also, what is interesting in the declaration of the Al-Ula summit is that the fact that they have focused a lot, in fact, on the economic side of things. They wanted to complete the process of the custom union, the free trade, the common market as well, the Gulf citizenship, awarding Gulf citizens, citizenship of all the countries and the same rights, etc. They wanted to, complete the electricity grid, the rail grid, all those projects that we were in the region hoping for and looking forward for them to go ahead for the benefit of the whole region. It seems that they have now got an impetus because of the resolution of the crisis. So in that sense, we are seeing quite an interesting development, as well as, of course, the communique or the declaration also talked about different other sectors that they can cooperate in, especially in security sector, the social side as well as of course cooperation with international partners. Now, when it comes to foreign policy issues, these are all very important, and all these sectors that they've been talking about and integration in these sectors are very important for any integration process to develop. As you know, integration theory tells us that you have to move from one stage to the other to move towards a union, or what the EU, as being, of course, the main example for this, has gone through so many stages of integration. And when it comes to foreign policy, it's always going to be challenging. Obviously, the closer you get to the sovereignty, the more challenging it is for member states to cede sovereignty. This is not just because our region is unique, or our countries are ruled by royal families and monarchies, etc. It's also the nature of the state itself. It's very difficult for states to cede sovereignty unless there is, of course, some important gains from it. So I think in the foreign policy, it will continue to be coordination and cooperation, but I don't think we're going to see much more, deeper, if you like, or closer foreign policy. Kuwait has its own calculations, that is a geostrategic calculation that is different from Oman and different from other countries, and Saudi Arabia, being the largest country in the group, also has its own foreign policy determinants that are different from the smaller Gulf states. So the best we can hope for is much more understanding of the situation of each country and their geostrategic settings, and how we can accommodate that and make it more plausible. But I think the focus should be on the economic side and the social integration, which we hope this is going to take place. I don't want to take a lot of your time, but I just want to say something that when it comes to Iran, the calculations of each country is very different. And it's not going to be, I don't think we should expect that we're going to have a one unified policy against, towards Iran. I think we should also accept that Iran is a regional country. We have issues with the Iranian policies in the region. And of course, we want to tackle them on that. But I think the best way to do this is through dialogue. Confrontation has not really won anything. We have seen it, we've tried it in the past, and we've seen how costly it can be. And we want to avoid conflicts and we want to avoid war. Yemen, and I will just be brief on that. I think Yemen is a disastrous policy of what happened in Yemen. We're not here to blame either side, but I think the best thing that the GCC could do now is to work together towards, first of all, ending the conflict and getting the parties to sit down and negotiate. There was a GCC initiative that was put earlier on before the conflict started, and I think that GCC initiative has now passed its time. It doesn't really work anymore. So what we need is a new GCC initiative, taking into consideration the realities of what is happening in Yemen and resolving the conflict there, stopping the humanitarian crisis, and also helping to rebuild Yemen and making it a good partner for the Gulf states. I don't know if I have much time, Dania, but I'm happy to go on or maybe answer any of the questions. I'm sorry about the technical issues with my laptop.
That's okay. We're all highly dependent on technology these days, and all of us probably have experienced a day or two where it hasn't cooperated with us. Thank you, Dr. Baabood, for your remarks. Several questions have emerged, and I think one of them, which Dr. Baabood did address in his remarks, are Iran relations. That's a big question mark for many, especially here in Washington. What are the future of Iranian relations, specifically when you look at the changing environment with the administration, the upcoming possible JCPOA agreement, and how will, for example, Qatar's relations change with Iran moving forward, or will it actually? That's an important question. Also, other actors such as the UAE, how has their relations evolved more recently, and how will the broader GCC's relations change in that regard? Would anybody like to take a stab at this question? Yes, Dr. Alrumaihi.
Yes, I would like to take this point and probably some other points very quickly. If we look to the communique which I referred to earlier, the issue of Iran is very clear. So if everybody has put his signature on that piece of paper, that means they agreed on the words towards Iran, and it was very harsh and very clear that first of all, the communique have put, I think, first of all, the interference of the Iranian in the region, the second, the missiles, and the third, the nuclear, energy, whatever it is. So I believe that the first one is very important to the GCC, the involvement of the Iranian in Yemen and Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and other places. This is one. The Iranian, I know that some of our colleagues rightly talks about human rights, and this is something we are all worried about. But to me, I'm a little bit puzzled that Biden administration, as they have promised, they will go back to the Obama nuclear deal with Iran, or some sort of developing this kind of agreement, without looking to the human rights issue in Iran, which is appalling. So this is what on Yemen, the communique has mentioned directly that we, the signatures, recognize the official government of Yemen. Even then, they mention the name of the head of the republic. So I mean, this is very clear. I do think that what has happened just a couple of days ago, that all the parties have recognized that the cost of the differences is very high. Although you can probably exaggerate the independence of the state, but at the end of the day, they need each other, and whatever foreign powers coming to help a smaller state, it comes with a price. So the price probably has gone up and up every time. So if we stick to the communique, we can see that most of the, if you like, issues have been agreed upon. We don't know what the head of states thinking. Second thing, we have heard the King of Bahrain is supporting the accord. That was officially. We have heard the foreign minister, the assistant foreign minister of UAE supporting the accord. So I believe there is a consensus here between most of them that we are on the verge of a new era. So how we can build on that? Of course, we have to develop our human rights record, generally speaking, and we have to do some sort of democracy, even with small d. But generally speaking, the people of the Gulf is much better than the other citizens around the area, financially, human rights even, and the quality of life. So generally speaking, we hope that everybody have come to understand that if we get together, we can have more power. But if one or two goes away, it could be very dangerous to this smaller state and to the other region. We should not exaggerate as well what Biden wants, Biden administration wants from Saudi Arabia and others. At the end of the day, Saudi Arabia has the power of deciding the oil prices worldwide. And that's very important, especially when the Biden administration looking to this warming, the words, what they call al-manakh, and this will bring the oil production in the United States much probably less, and they will depend on the oil of the GCC at all, specifically the Saudi Arabia. So I don't think that Biden or any other administration could have more leverage on Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. Mr. Biden, in his article at the Foreign Affairs, and I think in March last year, he said that we have to have the American America on the top of the table, I mean, worldwide. I wrote an article saying that probably America will have a chair on the table, but not at the head of the table. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Alrumaihi. Welcome, Dr. Baabood. We see you now. Does anybody want to take a stab at the questions? I will ask that you not take more than 2 minutes so we can just continue the conversation. Does anyone have anything they want to say with regards to my question about Iran GCC relations moving forward? Dr. Baabood, you are muted. I also have one add-on to that. For example, the negotiation of the JCPOA, would the GCC states play a role in mediating that? And how could that influence a deal that's more conducive to perhaps GCC interests as well? Are you unmuted now? You're still muted. Now we can see you, but we can't hear you. Does Courtney, Kistian, would you like to say anything about that until Dr. Baabood gets his microphone working? No? Okay. So let's move on to the other question. Did you have your hand up, Dr. Alrumaihi?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
I just very quick, I mean, it's an illusion to say that we can mediate between Iran and the GCC, because the Iranian has their own ideological framework, and it is very, very hard to have a dialogue.
Yeah, I'm not referring to the JCPOA, the Iran deal with the US and Iran. Like in the prior iteration, Oman played a role in back channel talks between the US and Iran. Is any Dr. Alrumaihi?
The Omani have hosted the meeting. They have, I mean, not that much role in mediating as such. They just facilitate the place to both of America and the Iranian to come together. But they are very hard, and you can see that, you know, they think, sorry, that they have been authorized by God to probably rule this area and, if possible, the world. So I don't think even the coming administration, if they enter with the Iranian in a discussion, it will be very, very hard.
Okay, Dr. Baabood, did you get your microphone fixed now, or I'm going to move on to the next question?
I hope so. If you can hear me, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Sorry, I've been busy trying to kind of fix this and trying to think what I'm going to say. But I just want to say that, look, we live in one region, and Iran is a neighbor, whether we like it or not. And we need to find ways of working, of finding a workable solution with them. And we can only do that through negotiations and dialogue, and not through conflict and antagonism. We have tried that in the past, and it didn't work. Not for us and not for them. I think they suffer, and I think we suffer as well because of this. They have certain ideologies which we don't accept. They have certain plans that we don't accept, but we can only resolve that through dialogue. Now, when we come to the GCPOA, the negotiations were extremely, extremely hard, and it was very difficult to arrive at what they have arrived at. It wasn't a perfect agreement. And I think try to renegotiate that now, it's going to be even much more difficult, given, of course, the entrenched positions. Perhaps what will be a good thing to do is go back to the agreement and then start working out from there. And there are issues within the agreement that can be renegotiated, but the United States, first of all, need to get back to the table to the JCPOA agreement, and then from there start to renegotiate, the sunset clause, and also at the same time have another dialogue that includes the weapons of mass destructions, the missiles, and also the policies of Iran in the region that can involve regional countries. But trying to involve regional countries now, with all respect, as much as we want to be part of that, it's just not going to move things forward. I think what the United States needs to do now is get back and get the Iranians back at the table, and then all of us with Iran can do a much wider agreement that includes not just missiles and conflict resolution, etc., but also more cooperation, and that is, economic and social and so on. We need to live in this neighborhood, and if we can have, or some of our countries can have peace with Israel, why can't they also think about having peace with Iran? And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Baabood. Indeed, I think those are both good points and different views that we just witnessed here across the GCC. There's a lot of variation in perspective, and I think that's important and worthy to remember. The next question, which Dr. Baabood just mentioned, are relations with Israel. Some of our audience members are curious to see, does this GCC summit have any effect on future relations with Israel? Does anyone would like to take a stab for that? Okay, Dr. Mehi.
I'm sorry to intervene, but I do think that Israel has some sort of connection, either clandestinely or obvious. They have the relation now between Israel and Bahrain and United Arab Emirates. Doha has some sort of relation, as we know. The Saudis have agreed the flight of Al Al over the Saudi Arabia. So I think the development is coming soon, and we remember that the late Sultan Qaboos have received Mr. Netanyahu in Muscat. So all of those, if you like, development tell us that the issue of Israel is not an issue can differ the GCC countries on. At the end of the day, I believe even the Palestinians have agreed that whatever relation between GCC and Israel could benefit their cause.
Thank you. Does anybody have anything they'd like to add to that before we go on to the next question? Okay. So in reference to Saudi Arabia, this is a question. I'm just bringing questions from the audience. A primary question is, how do you foresee Saudi Arabia changing its overall behavior with reference to foreign policy? Is this a historic agreement kind of a beginning of a new policy of engagement with Saudi Arabia, with regional actors? Somebody like to answer that? Okay, no one wants to answer that question. Okay, let's move on to Turkey. Do you think that Gulf-Turkey relations will change in light of the agreement with the GCC summit?
I guess the answers to all of these questions are a bit difficult to find, because I think a lot of it depends on how intra-GCC relations develop after the summit. I mean, how close will this relationship become? I mean, right now we just have, we have a text and we have, kind of the rhetoric about moving forward with this relationship, but we're not really sure still how closely allied these states will be. So will they align themselves vis-a-vis Turkey, vis-a-vis Israel? I think it's really difficult to know. And with the new Biden administration coming in, that's another variable that we're unsure about. But I guess it is worth noting, with regards to any kind of American administration, there can often be a lot tougher rhetoric than action. And so, we may think that the Biden administration will change its relationship with Saudi moving forward, but it's really unclear whether that will actually happen.
Okay, Dr. Ulrichsen?
Yeah, I'll just add on what Courtney just said as well. I mean, I agree. There's no kind of Gulf-Turkey consensus. There's no Gulf-Turkey relationship anymore. There's no Gulf-Israel or Gulf-Iran relationship. I mean, there's always been a difference of agreement and a lack of consensus among the 6 states on these foreign policy relationships. Where I think there will be maybe changes in terms of the Saudi-Turkey issues, which do seem to have quietened down over the last few months. There does seem to have been a thawing in some of that sort of antagonism between Saudi and Turkey, which then begs the question then, if UAE-Turkey relations continue to deteriorate and to assume region-wide implications, how does that then play out across the region? So I think instead of looking at it kind of at a regional level, looking at different states kind of relationships is perhaps an easier issue. And then just about the Saudi, whether they'll change their behavior, I think it will adapt. I mean, it has to adapt just because the international context is very different in 2021 than it was in 2015 and 2016 and 2017. And so I think that adaptation, that evolution is something that the Biden administration will probably work with. They'll have to work with. And so I think this is just part of that process of getting from the Trump era into a new and potentially more conciliatory era, at least at the beginning, and then seeing how things play out from there on in.
Thank you. And what structural challenges do you foresee coming after, in light of the agreement that happened yesterday between the GCC states?
What do you mean by structural agreement, or what does it mean?
Challenges. What sort of structural challenges do you foresee in the upcoming months with regard to the agreement? What do you think are the main challenges that they need to overcome in order for this agreement to succeed moving forward?
Well, if I may, I am always skeptical of all these agreements. We have seen so many of them. As much as I am really happy to hear that there is a reconciliation and that the countries are back together, trying to work together and to move the GCC forward, I've grown to be skeptical because we've heard so many of these agreements and they have been signed and they were really great declarations and speeches that were made, and then nothing happens, or maybe even the opposite happens. I think we have to be realistic. We have gone through a very, very difficult period. 3.5 years of one country, a member of the GCC, has been put under a blockade, where other countries were not consulted that are part of this organization, which is the GCC. And the blockade affects the main agreement, which is the common market agreement. And again, the GCC wasn't consulted, the member states wasn't consulted, GCC mechanisms were not at all involved. So I am always skeptical that just hugging and kissing and writing a good declaration is not going to end things very quickly. It will take a long time because the cost and the injury has been quite deep. So we need to work at this, all of us together. And the most important thing for me, the most structural change that I think should come out of this is to have the GCC, to rebuild the GCC again through the GCC charter that has been put in the 1980s. That life has moved on since then. So we need to rewrite the GCC charter to take into consideration the new realities. We need to create new mechanisms within the GCC, like conflict resolution mechanism, so that if there are conflicts, and obviously life is full of conflicts, that people can sit together through a mechanism, through conflict resolution mechanism, and resolve those conflicts, and don't let those conflicts linger on, costing the organization, costing the people and the countries of this region. We need to have a new way of thinking. And if I may also go back to the first question, is what Saudi Arabia foreign policy will it change? I think Saudi Arabia is a leader of this GCC group. It's the largest country, and of course all the countries in the region look up to Saudi Arabia to lead this organization. Like in Europe, you have Germany and France leading, if you like, the GCC, the EU integration, the European integration. So Saudi Arabia needs to change its policies in that sense to make sure that that the smaller countries are comfortable within this organization. It needs to make sure that they feel that this is a security community, that they can work together and they have their say. I think Saudi Arabia has a lot to do in this respect, given its weight in the organization, and I believe also it needs to respect these smaller countries, and I'm sure there is going to be some kind of recalculation, because the previous policies have costed all of us, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, of course, part of this crisis, but all other member states, and also the regional integration project. So we need to think about, do we really need this project to succeed? And Saudi Arabia needs to think if this is to its benefit, which I think it is to its benefit, and it's to the benefit of everybody who lives in the region. So we need to be realistic about the future and how it will work. And I don't think we should just go about being happy about the declaration. Of course we are happy about the hug and the kisses and everything. Of course we are happy about the reconciliation. Of course we are happy. But there is a lot of hard work that needs to be put into place. And I think we need to face that reality. Otherwise we'll be just eluding ourselves once again. Sorry, I kept on going with this.
Thank you, Dr. Baabood. Does anyone else have anything they want to add to this before I go on to your last 2-minute round each? Dr. Alrumaihi?
Yes, while we are speaking now, I believe the border between Qatar and Saudi Arabia is opening, and within a few hours, things will be rolling there between Qatar and the eastern province of Saudi Arabia. And this is good news. Going back to your question on the structure, I do believe I'll be more, if you like, happy to hear that ambassadors have been sworn in Riyadh, Doha as well, as soon as possible. So this kind of things make things easier. I agree with Dr. Abdulla that we need a mechanism for problem solving, and this idea of problem solving is there in the chart from the beginning, and that was the idea of Sheikh Jabir Al Ahmed, God save his soul, since early 80s. Unfortunately, it has not been developed. We need this mechanism, so we can solve the problems arises between either one or two or more of those countries. The stake of bickering, if you like, to me as a Gulf citizen, is very high. We all have paid a bigger price since the crisis have started, and fortunately that there was some wisdom in every country, that we have heard the voices that please stop this and go back to the politics and solve your problem. Now we are entering into an era, and I would say that me as a Kuwaiti citizen, I look to the reforms taken by Mohammed bin Salman as a positive. I mean, women, economy, sort of, a number of things, in fact, is happening in Saudi Arabia, and this is a must because the Saudis have, if you like, come out of age, and this is good. What we need in the Gulf in general is to build the idea of modern government. This can even help. Even the Iranian people can look at us and say, well, they have a positive experiment. I want to finish by saying that the negotiation with Iran very hard, because I know, and probably my friends here know, that once 4 years ago, a summit meeting have decided to send a letter to the Iranian to get into discussion, and our foreign minister, now he is our prime minister, at that time took this letter to them, and they say, no, thank you very much. We are not going to enter into discussion with you as a group. We would like to discuss individually between you and us, and we don't have any problem with Kuwait. We don't have any problem with Doha. We have the problem with Saudi Arabia, and this will leave it the last. This is not acceptable. In fact, thank you.
I forgot myself on mute. We're going to go back and have everyone kind of give a quick, maybe 1 to 2 minute overview of some points maybe you missed. And perhaps, if you would like, in your final remarks, talk about how optimistic you are, and in the events that occurred yesterday at the GCC summit. How optimistic you are about the future. Let's go ahead and start with Dr. Freer.
Great, thank you. I wanted to make, I guess, just 2 points. Broadly speaking, I've seen a lot of comments in the kind of comment box about the levels of animosities that existed over this 3.5-year period, and whether there are different calculations across different countries of the GCC when it comes to the rapprochement. And I guess one thing that I'd want to stress is that the GCC can be more functional without having these states agree on absolutely everything. I mean, multilateralism doesn't imply that there's complete agreement across the board on everything from Iran to Israel to Yemen. So in fact, it's unrealistic to think that these states would all agree on everything. But I do think that we can still have a functioning GCC. We can start with things like the customs union, building the rail projects, the electricity grid, things like that can help build up trust without these states necessarily all taking on the same foreign policy agenda. So that's kind of one point that I wanted to make. And the second one is that, and I guess this is related to whether I'm optimistic. I'm hopeful that lessons have been learned from what's happened in the past. So we had the Riyadh Agreement of 2014, which eventually was, I guess, broached, and this led to the 2017 start of the blockade. And I think one of the problems there was that there were no real protections in terms of it wasn't clear what was, I guess, required of each party, what expectations were on either side. what institutional protections there were for different member states of the GCC. And so I think that hopefully lessons have been learned in terms of how to make sure an agreement that is put in place is realistic and also respectful of all of the member states involved, so that something like this doesn't happen again, and so that the GCC can be functional and we don't have one member state being alienated again. So I'm hopeful that lessons have been learned over the 2014 rift, the 2017 start of the blockade, and hopefully now the GCC can move on from this.
Thank you, Courtney. Dr. Ulrichsen?
Yeah, thank you. That was actually my point as well, that the lessons of 2014 to 2017 have to be learned, in the sense that the agreement signed this time around cannot, if it goes the way of the 2014 agreement and becomes an object of contestation, of recrimination further down the line, because all parties think the other hasn't complied or has violated, then it won't be constructive. And I think that was one of the problems of the previous agreements. Of course, the fact that 2017 happened after 2014 means there is a legacy of some mistrust among all parties, that agreements aren't just pieces of paper, they have to be acted upon. So I think there needs to be some way of monitoring, verifying, and compliance, and that needs to be set in motion going forward. And that leads back to the need for the GCC to somehow reinsert itself into that decision-making process, whereby it has that dispute mechanism, which is used going forward. Because in 2017, the GCC was absent because it wasn't the vehicle for the grievances against Qatar to be kind of conveyed through. And then it was mediation by the Emir of Kuwait with Rex Tillerson. Subsequently going forward, it wasn't used as the vehicle for mediation either. So kind of ensuring that all parties, not just one party, but all parties, sort of make concessions and then abide by those concessions and are seen to do so, I think would be absolutely critical, because otherwise we could just see 2021 Al-Ula agreement going the same way as the 2014 Riyadh one and becoming the main item of contestation of the next round, whenever that may be.
Thank you, Christian. Dr. Baabood?
Thank you. I would echo what Courtney and Christian have said, and that is, if we don't learn from our past and from our experiences, then we have not really, we're not gonna see the future. So obviously we have to learn from there, and not repeat the same old mistakes that have happened in the past. But also, given the fact that I am always a positive person, I look for a better future. Despite all the problems that we have in the region, I think this region has a lot to show for. It's a very important strategic region. It has very a long, if you like, a strategic relationship with the United States, with Europe, with other global powers. It's very important in terms of course, strategic value of oil and hydrocarbon gas, etc. And at the same time, their economies is developing, but they are still small countries. And they can only develop if they are part of a much larger economic space and a common market, a single market. The GCC is one way of doing it. And it's a very good way of doing it, because this is the countries are compatible to a certain extent. So we should, of course, work very hard to ensure that the GCC keeps functioning for the benefit of the young people who are now increasing in numbers. Also, we have young leadership in these countries that have different visions from the past, as Dr. Alrumaihi had mentioned in Saudi Arabia and Prince Mohammed, etc. And obviously, we with this young population, with young leadership and highly educated as well, there is a good future there. But we shouldn't just think that we just live on our own island. We also have neighbors, and we have to also find ways of engaging with our neighbors, whether it is Iraq, whether it is Jordan, whether it is Yemen. We need to enlarge that economic space and the market. And only if our neighbors are also living in peace and prosperity that we can live in peace and prosperity. And we also have to work closely with our partners in the United States, in Europe, and in Asia as well, Russia, to ensure that we can, that their interests are reconciled with our interests, and so that we can overcome any conflicts in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Now moving to Dr. Alrumaihi.
Yeah, I think I'll go with the idea of Dr. Ferez, which she said that the economic cooperation is of highly importance, and I believe they talk about it in this communique in a number of items. And I'll go with Dr. Ulrichsen that we should have some sort of mechanism and learn from our mistakes. I want just to add that we have a young population, very energetic, and I think it's very good administration. Just to show you, one of my ideas that tackling COVID-19. The largest inoculation in the Middle East was Israel. The second is Bahrain. The third is UAE. So you can see how things could be organized. That's really something. I took the shot just the other day, and it was amazing how things was organized. In 5-6 minutes, you can finish. From the optimistic or pessimistic point of view, thanks God that we have very good word in English. I am cautiously optimistic.
I was actually going to summarize everyone's point with the term cautiously optimistic. There are indeed lessons that needed to be learned, and hopefully they did. The event yesterday was historic. It was very positive. There was a sense of unity, but there are also concerns moving forward, and we look forward to seeing positive developments in 2021. It was a good start, comparatively speaking, and I want to thank all of our speakers for joining us today on short notice, because all of the events happened yesterday, and there's a lot to dissect and not enough information yet to fully dissect it. I appreciate everyone that attended our event. This year we will have a very busy one moving forward, dissecting regional events that are important to policymakers both in the US and the Gulf. And we look forward to engaging you all more throughout the year. Thank you very much.